Before the actual video, let me just say thank you guys so much for blowing that last video up. I honestly never expected it to hit that many views this fast, so thank you guys for that. Also, thank you for pointing out my god-awful audio editing. Hopefully that's better in this video. So, I posted this poll. You guys got 4 options, and you picked World War III. You really want to see the world burn, huh? Well, despite the attire, this is a democracy, so here we go. During the Cold War, there were many moments where the world could have gone to an apocalyptic hellhole in a matter of days, but that's not what we're looking at today. Today, we're looking at a Cold War crisis that wouldn't have resulted in instant destruction of humanity, but rather partial destruction of humanity over a much longer period of time. So without all the initial yapping out of the way, let's get to how this crisis unfolded in our timeline for some context. So, it's the end of World War II, and Germany is divided into 4 different occupation zones. The capital, Berlin, is as well. The US President Franklin D. Roosevelt had a soft and collaborative approach to the USSR, seeking global peace through the cooperation of the major powers. He died a little before the end of the war, leaving his vice president, Harry Truman, who didn't have such a nice view of the Soviets, in charge. After the war, he created the United Nations and took a hardline stance against the USSR, believing they were intent on global domination. He introduced the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine, aiming to rebuild Western Europe and stop Soviet expansion by supporting quote-unquote democratic regimes. This effectively kicked off the Cold War, setting the stage for extremely high global tensions for the next few decades. Although, to be fair to Truman, the Soviets were rigging elections in Eastern Europe to make sure it was under their control, so his fears weren't unwarranted. The first sign of the Cold War came when Germany was split into East and West, same for Berlin. The Soviets cut off supplies to West Berlin, prompting the US and Western allies to launch the Berlin airlift. There was also another division in Korea between the US and USSR, which led to the Korean War, the first of many proxy conflicts. While the Soviet and American-backed forces clashed many times during the conflict, they never fought each other head-on because, that would cause a nuclear war. They came close though, as tension spiked in Berlin once a wall between the East and West was put up to prevent people from leaving from East to West. The Soviets also prevented Western military personnel as well as diplomat Albert Hemzig from entering East Berlin, a violation of the Potsdam Conference back in 1945. This angered General Lucius D. Clay, who sent in 10 jeeps with infantry to support Hemzig, and placed 10 tanks right at the border of East Berlin. The Soviets responded with sending in 33 of their own. The American and Soviet tanks had a tense standoff. However, eventually talks between the US President Kennedy and the USSR Premier Khrushchev convinced the tanks to move back 5 meters. This continued until the tanks backed off completely, ending the crisis. In a speech, Kennedy remarked that it's not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. Indeed it was, Kennedy. Indeed it was. So let's make that war happen, shall we? So let's rewind. The Soviet and American tanks are standing off. Negotiations never begin, so this continues for quite a while. Until one side fires. Maybe they fell asleep and accidentally hit the wrong button, I don't know, but whatever happened, one side fired. That press of a button, that single movement, would be the trigger for millions of deaths. The Soviets retaliate, firing back at the Americans, and the Battle of Berlin begins. But historically inaccurate, when did nuclear war break out? Well, I'm glad you asked, and my answer is no, not yet. Just wait, nukes will come in a second. Right now, I'm going to go over strategy. So back to the outbreak of war, the West actually had a plan if this did happen, so thankfully we have this to go off of. That plan was BERCON, standing for Berlin Contingency Plan. It outlined how NATO would respond to basically this exact situation. First of all, NATO would try to secure air superiority over East Germany by destroying Soviet and GDR air bases. This was called BERCON Alpha 2, and after that would come BERCON Bravo. This was just a warning, dropping nuclear weapons on military targets. In terms of ground operations, NATO planned the 4 Charlie operations to push deep into East Germany and encircle large amounts of enemy forces east of Kassel. Thank you Google Gemini for helping me decode this cryptic military language. What the hell is a salient? By the way, that paragraph took me like half an hour to write. I really need to learn more military terminology. Navally, NATO would just search Soviet bloc ships. Not much to that one, thank goodness. So to sum it up, NATO would mainly focus on maintaining air superiority and launch an invasion of East Germany. Surprisingly, I couldn't find anything about launching nuclear bombs right away. Instead, it seemed like they wanted to wait until Soviet intentions were revealed. On the ground, it would be mostly defensive, with a minor push into East Germany. On the Soviet side, I did find a plan called 7 Days to the River Rhine, but that was developed in 1964, so I really didn't have that much to go off of. However, since 7 Days to the River Rhine was made only 3 years later, I could assume that their plan was something like it. 7 Days would be a response to a nuclear strike by the Americans. Not exactly our scenario, but we could still work with it. In response, the Soviets planned to launch their own weapons at West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, Denmark, and northeastern Italy. Interestingly, France and the UK were spared in this plan, most likely because they were also nuclear powers. Following the nuclear strikes, the Soviets would launch a 7-day-long campaign, invading West Germany up to the Rhine, likely to avoid overextension. There were additional plans to push all the way to the Pyrenees, but many in the USSR thought this was unrealistic, so it likely wouldn't have been implemented. So now we know the plans of both sides, but what would they actually do if they fought each other in an actual war? Well, on the Soviet side, 7 days would be a response to nuclear weapons, something we know NATO wouldn't drop until they knew the situation called for it. Anywho, back to the Battle of Berlin. It's a Soviet victory. Not even a question, I mean, look at this. By the time the news reaches the US, war would be declared and the Berlin contingency plan would go into full effect. Western Europe mobilizing their forces and the US sending its across the Atlantic. The US did have a large military presence in Europe, but it isn't nearly enough to hold off the Soviets. The initial days of the war would see the USSR and its allies invade West Germany, Western Europe setting up defenses all along the Rhine and the Alps, and a massive air battle began to secure control of the German skies. In Asia, North Korea would launch its second invasion of the South, and with the US military preoccupied in Europe, only the ROK Army, current US military presence in Korea, along with the Japan Self-Defense Force would remain to fend off the DPRK. Would this be enough? I would say it would be enough to fend off the DPRK, but China could also get involved, which would not be too good for the West. Going back to the main theater, by the time the full might of the US military arrives in Europe, most of West Germany would have fallen, and Turkey and Greece would be fighting for their lives in the mountains. However, the arrival of the US would mean the swaying of the scale in NATO's favor, and the far larger US Air Force would gain air superiority over the USSR, implementing all three Burkhan Alpha plans, even Bravo. How would the Soviets react to this? There's a high chance they could see it as the beginning of a massive NATO nuclear bombing campaign across the Eastern Bloc, and would launch their own nuclear weapons at multiple targets in Western Europe outlined in 7 Days to the Rhine. I predict that northeast Italy will be the most affected by this. That would allow the Soviets to finally break through the Alps, taking the devastated northeast section of Italy and making a breakthrough past the Rhine and into the Benelux region. In response to the Soviet nuclear strikes, the US would launch their own arsenal. So, just real quick, you would expect the Soviet and American nuclear arsenals to be relatively equal in size, right? Wrong. Take a look at this graph real quick. Look at 1961 and oh my god, that is quite a large difference. But, in terms of technology, the Soviets were surpassing them, even developing the Tsar Bomba by this time. I'm sure all of you are familiar with our good friend Douglas MacArthur, right? You know, the guy who proposed turning the Chinese border with Korea into, quote, a sea of irradiated cobalt. Well, MacArthur, it's your lucky day. The USA did have a nuclear war plan developed in 1956, but I don't think the US would actually do this, as it would lead the Soviets to launch basically all of theirs. I think that nuclear strikes in this war would not be all out, as there would be a silent agreement between both sides to not cause global destruction and use their weapons in restraint. Instead, the US would launch about the same amount of bombs as the USSR did at civilian and military targets as another warning to the USSR. After this, both sides would silently agree not to use nuclear weapons on such a large scale during the conflict. Or they could just not do that and blow the world to smithereens, but that's unlikely in my opinion, and it would end the scenario right here, so we're not doing that. As the war drags on into 1963, it has largely stalemated in Europe and Asia. The Italian Peninsula and Benelux regions are the main battlefields in Europe, the front lines along the Rhine stagnating into something akin of trench warfare. In Asia, the US finally lands more troops on Korea, pushing the North back to pre-war borders. Throughout the war, the US has enjoyed naval and air supremacy, being the major factor why the Eastern Bloc can't push past the Rhine. But as things are looking okay for America, something happens that stirs up quite the crisis back at home. Kennedy is shot. Widespread panic across the US ensues, allowing the USSR to expand their spy network and push further into the Benelux and Italy. Eventually, the US stabilizes and is able to get their head back in the game. Both sides would want to open new fronts, and to the west that front will be Central Asia. Iran had held friendly relations with the West for a while now, and would more likely than not allow it to move NATO troops through Iranian territory. And so the Central Asian front opens up, NATO forces launching a blitzkrieg-style attack into the Turkmen SSR. They're able to push deep into the flat terrain, making it all the way to Kazakhstan, before Soviet reinforcements are diverted from Western Europe to stop them. This would let NATO forces in Europe push the Eastern Bloc out of Italy and the Benelux, and possibly even go on an offensive to recapture land past the Rhine. This would be a nightmare for the USSR, and they would be getting pushed back on all fronts by now. But they did still have an idea to sway the war back in their favor. China. Initially, I don't know if China would have joined, as the Sino-Soviet split had already begun. They would assist North Korea for sure, but I don't think they'd be very involved on other fronts. The Soviets needed China to win the war, so they would convince them that if the USSR fell, China would follow soon after, and that if they wanted communism to survive, they would have to work together. I think this argument would work, and China would officially join the war. The US would be pushed back to the Pusan perimeter, and Chinese forces would officially begin being shifted to Central Asia and Europe. China would also invade Taiwan, finally ending the Chinese Civil War. The West could see that if they wanted to win the war, they would have to secure a major victory over the Eastern Bloc. With this in mind, NATO would build off the momentum they had gained in Western Europe and fight the USSR back to Berlin in a massive offensive with lengthy air support. Would this work? I think so. As the US had air superiority in Germany since the beginning of the war, the nuclear counterattack from the US would have significantly weakened the Soviet satellite states, and Soviet forces were diverted to Central Asia. So, by the summer of 1966, Berlin, the city that started it all, would have fallen to the West. This would be a major military victory, but it would also have a major psychological impact, boosting troop morale. This surprise offensive would be shocking to the Soviets, who wouldn't have the time to regroup themselves before NATO pushes further into Eastern Europe. The Soviets would need their own victory, so would finally break through Turkish lines and turn the Black Sea into a lake. In Asia, the West wouldn't be doing too good though, as Korea would be reunited under the DPRK, and Taiwan would be Taiwan. Get it? I'm so funny. I'm sorry. And Southeast Asia would be all red. Speaking of which, what had been going on in Southeast Asia this whole time? Well, the Vietnam War would have been in full swing, but since there were more important fronts to focus on, Saigon would fall much earlier. Alright, that was a lot to take in, so let's just give a quick recap on the war thus far, and who is on whose side. USSR invades West Germany up to the Rhine, US launches a warning nuke that the Soviets think is an actual nuke and bombs the Benelux and Italy. They make it past the Alps and the Rhine, Second Korean War, Central Asian front opens up, China joins, Asia is won for the Eastern Bloc, massive surprise attack into Eastern Europe, and here we are. This is a map of the sides. With NATO making massive gains into Eastern Europe, the USSR finally decides to test out their new weapons. If you thought the Iron Curtain was bad, just wait for the Uranium Curtain. I love making jokes while talking about World War III. Devastation reigns across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states as the Soviets retreat and the last of their satellite states in Eastern Europe fall. By 1967, the USSR is in a desperate situation and decides to just hunker down and play the defensive game. The US responds to the nuclear strikes with their own, nuking cities in the Russian heartland. Khrushchev is evacuated inland as St. Petersburg and Moscow erupt in flames. Amongst the chaos, NATO relaunches their Central Asian campaign, largely kicking the Soviets out of the region apart from the especially mountainous Kyrgyz and Tajik SSRs. Khrushchev could see the writing on the wall at this point and decides to sue for peace with the West. A ceasefire is called and peace talks are held in largely neutral India in late 1967. The USSR's satellite states are replaced with pro-Western governments and its SSRs are made independent countries. The Russian SSR is made into a transitional government based in Gorky, now known as Nizhny Novgorod, holding a referendum on the new government. While the war in Europe may be over, China is still the hegemon of Asia and relatively powerful. The West would see this as a threat and would focus all of their efforts on taking back Korea, Taiwan, and Indochina. Although China is powerful militarily, it's important to remember that they aren't even industrialized yet, so I don't think they would fare well against the West. Objective number 1 for the West would be to make a landing on Korea, which they would be able to do after gaining naval superiority. With the combined forces of all NATO navies, after a few battles in the East China and Yellow Seas, the West would gain near complete control of the Western Pacific. With that, Western forces would embark from Japan to make multiple landings on Korea, the Chinese coastal forces already being worn down by multiple naval raids. Within a matter of months, South Korea would be recaptured and the West would push northward to the Amnok River. Another naval landing would be made in Taiwan, securing the island as a possible jumping-off point for an invasion of China. By 1968, the Korean Peninsula would be reunited under the Southern government, and Taiwan would be under a Western military occupation since the KMT leadership would have been purged after the island was taken by China. Actually, taking China though would be a logistical nightmare, so the West would look towards their already existing independence movements in Tibet and Xinjiang. Western intelligence would trick China into thinking they were attempting to invade elsewhere, but they would actually invade Xinjiang with collaboration from Central Asian states, the Russian transitional government, and Uyghur nationalists. Not expecting the attack, Xinjiang quickly falls and the Republic of East Turkestan is proclaimed. So far, India has been neutral, not joining the East due to territorial disputes with China and not joining the West for quite obvious reasons. This would change when Western forces offer India an amazing deal, Tibetan independence, and the ceding of all territory claimed by India currently under PRC control. In exchange, India lets Western forces cross through its territory to fight the PLA in Tibet. The West closely collaborates with Tibetan guerrillas and the Central Tibetan administration to push China out of Tibet. Seeing as the PRC amassed the vast majority in the east, Tibet easily falls within a month or two of fighting. After the loss of Tibet and Xinjiang, the PRC decides to negotiate a peace deal before the West can advance further into China. As the West held most of the cards in the negotiations, China is forced to accept the independence of Tibet, East Turkestan, and Taiwan, demilitarize southern Manchuria, and introduce governmental reforms that undermine the CCP's power and allow for multiple parties. Why wouldn't the West just create an entirely new government? Well, they hadn't secured a complete victory over China, and if they were to invade the Chinese heartland, it would be a mess, leaving them to negotiate a conditional surrender instead. And so World War III would be over, leaving hundreds of millions dead and establishing Western global hegemony. Well, that was a long video. Oh my god, I didn't even go over the societal effects yet.